you evict a population from where they live and concentrate them in an area where they cannot survive. The first act, architectural act, was done. Gaza was divided in two. There was a north that became a kind of a kill zone. There were about 1 million people, more than 1 million people, pushed onto the border to Rafa.
Just give us a sense of how Israel has behaved in a strategic way to create destruction.
There was nothing. It turned the strip into a kind of a moonscape. The Gaza Strip is the Gaza siege.
It's from 1948. Just sort of what were the water sources available to people in Gaza? And then secondly, what's the legacy of the tunnels?
Out of those indigenous techniques emerged really the most ingenious kind of architectural project of anti-colonial struggle. A kind of a death that degrades condition of life, that slowly make the area unlivable so that people would either die or leave.
Weizman, okay. Eyal Weizman.
W is like V, Weizman,
okay. Eyal Weizman, okay, great. Hi, good day and welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. I'm your host, Ishwar Kareem, and I'm joined today by Eyal Weizman.
Hello.
Hi, Eyal, how are you doing?
Good, yeah, great to be back on this program, I guess.
Yeah, Eyal is the director of forensic architecture. You may be familiar with what he and his team do. They basically put together and reconstruct and show you various atrocities, not just in Gaza and in Israel, or committed by Israel, but around the world. But obviously a large part of his focus has always been about the West Bank and Gaza and everything else. Eyal, really, really great to have you on the show. And I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Yeah, good to be here.
Okay, so we're going to be, I'm just to let the audience know, we're going to be discussing what forensic architecture does, how they put things together. We're obviously going to be speaking about the crimes that Israel has committed in the last 18 months during its genocide in Gaza. But we're also going to be speaking about Eyal's general work and the history of how Israel has used architecture and space in both the West Bank and the Gaza to kind of really go, like there's this ongoing ethnic cleansing and occupation, and show how architecture sort of how they've managed to deal with all of this through architecture. So yeah, just to begin with, since October 7th, just from the work forensic architecture has been doing, can you talk to us just about how, like, give us a better sense, because all of us have been seeing these images of horrible things coming out of Gaza, but give us a sense through the great research that your team does, just on how devastating this genocide has been.
Well, I can start by saying how devastating it has been for our team and for our partners in Gaza. We've been working over the past several years with an organization in Gaza called Ein Media, still working, still producing excellent visual presentation and stories from Gaza. And on October 7th, 2023, three of its members lost contact. And I guess we entered into this genocide not really doing accountability work, but looking for our partners, people that we worked with, friends. The organization was looking for them on the ground, and we were looking for them amongst hundreds of thousands of images, trying to piece together what may have happened to them. And since then, we have lost more colleagues and friends and staff at Forensic Architecture, Palestinians, of course, but people who were born in Gaza, people who are from families of refugees that grew up in Gaza, and they've lost family members. So it has been an incredibly emotionally challenging time and very difficult to produce work. But when we have, so to speak, caught our breath, we understood also that the normal methods that forensic architecture is using by meticulous reconstruction of incident by incident, telling the stories from testimonies of people at the forefront, from videos that they record and videos from other sources, building those meticulous 3D reconstructions that I guess we are known for, we were wondering, is that the right thing to do, facing the most overwhelming attack, I think, in the history of recent warfare. When I say recent, I mean, in the past century or so, the bombing of Gaza that began on October 7th was the biggest bombing campaign in the history of aerial warfare. There were literally tens of thousands of one-ton bombs that are being dropped right straight into heavily populated areas in first weeks, while the army was building up its forces outside what's called the envelope, outside the fences of Gaza. On the 13th of October, I think a week into the genocide, we understood and started calling it a genocide because of this incomprehensible order to evacuate the entirety of Gaza City and everything north of Wadi Gaza. It's a small seasonal stream that cuts the Gaza Strip in two, and Israel gave 48 hours for everybody to evacuate a modern city. And we understood that is of a completely different scale and of a completely different intention than anything that Israel has done since the Nakba. So we were geared up to actually look at and collect videos, collect testimonies that we found online or that were sent to us. As I said, we have many connections in Gaza, so people directly send material to us. And we were knowing that, sometimes the material disappears from social media websites. We were archiving it, cataloging it, and my colleague Noor was saying, when we were asking, what are we doing? Does it even matter to produce evidence in the face of such a scale of atrocity? She was saying to me, we need to look at those images. And when I say at those images, I mean tens of thousands of images of the worst atrocities that could be imagined. She said, we need to look at them so that others don't have to look at them. And of course, we're trained at looking at images, and we understand the potential also how to mitigate the trauma of that can come with being exposed to such images. And we were just logging them in, putting them on a map, verifying and cataloging that, and being exposed on a minute, granular level to the worst atrocities that we have seen committed anywhere. So I think that we were committed. We understood that the genocide is about the totality of the action. It's not about this or that act. There was no question of who done it. There was Israel's total control of the airspace. And, from the beginning of November 2023, has rolled in and started demolishing everything on its way. And it was simply about giving an image of the totality of the act in order to support, what everybody was screaming in the streets, and also us and our members were screaming in the streets, stop the genocide. Every single video was a cry to stop the genocide. And the world was standing by as besieged people behind fences were being massacred live.
It has been a very difficult war to look at, and a genocide to look at and see. Give us a sense, because I think most people watching this program and most people watching obviously have seen videos, but it's almost like it's been going on for so long that often we forget sort of the architecture of the 18 months of genocide. You mentioned the order on the 13th of October for most of Gaza's residents in Gaza City and in the north to kind of move to the south, or to what were called safe zones. But just give us a sense of how Israel has behaved in a strategic way to create destruction. How they've made safe zones unsafe, how they've cut Gaza up, how they've created entrance zones, the extent of the damage. Just sort of, if you can, I know it's a very difficult thing to do, but if you can, sort of through all the various research you've done, sort of give us a very like a 5 or 10 minute narrative on what's occurred in the last 18 months to just give us a sense of the devastation from like the calculated devastation.
Yeah, so what you say is absolutely right. At the beginning, everything seemed haphazard, omnipresent, confusing, chaotic, but slowly a picture came into focus, and that was the architecture of the genocide. And when I say the architecture of the genocide, I mean that destruction is not haphazard, that destruction is a way of transforming space and putting another space, creating another space through those acts of destruction. And that has clear plan to it. And in fact, the fact that there is a clear spatial system that is being guiding the Israeli military as it was committing the genocide is a very important evidence that we have actually prepared also for the South Africa legal team in The Hague that has brought to the International Court of Justice claims the genocide case. The architecture shows intent. It is actually shows that this is not, that destruction is not the result of haphazard exchange of fire, as Israel always tries to claim, though. There were Hamas fighters there or Islamic Jihad fighters here, and we shot at this building or that house because they were there. But the destruction added up to a master plan, to a shape. And that master plan is also transformed throughout the duration. And it's true that on the 13th of October, the first architectural act was done. Gaza was divided in two. There was a north that became a kind of a kill zone. Everybody was asked to go to the south, which was supposed to be more like a safe or humanitarian space, although it was also bombed, and routes to it were bombed, and everything that was actually afflicted on the north was also afflicted on the south. But in their kind of architectural conception, they wanted to see the north emptied and to push people further and further south, squeeze them against the border to Egypt at Rafa, and hoping that the border would collapse under the weight of the peoples displaced, and that those displaced persons would flood into the Sinai, into Egypt. And there was a lot of pressure on Egypt at the time to open the borders, and Egypt kept them closed, except of very a kind of irregular cases that it allowed people to leave. The border was closed. There were about 1 million people, more than 1 million people, pushed onto the border to Rafah. You would say that if it was a military campaign rather than an attempt to ethnically expel Palestinians from Gaza or destroy them, that military campaign, you would go on both sides. The army would enter from the north and from the south, and would encircle it, but it didn't. It left intentionally the southern border open. There were no Israeli strikes and no Israeli military presence along the what's called Philadelphia corridor, and they tried to push them away. In the first spring, in the spring of 2004, Israel realized it's unable to do it. The border is not collapsing, and decided to move on Rafah, and he did so. And then slowly emerged this so-called humanitarian zone. Now, when we speak about humanitarian zone on the coastal dunes of Al-Mawasi, we need to remember that in settler colonial contexts, expulsion is always argued as a kind of humanitarian act. So we must not be confused by the humanitarian rhetoric of the Israeli army. If you think about settler colonial context in the Americas, the word reservations, well, they seem to be a place where you reserve and you conserve and you protect, or protectorates are also, colonial terms for, safe zones or humanitarian zones. They were always part of a genocidal campaign. You evict a population from where they live and concentrate them in an area where they cannot survive. And Al-Mawasi, which is a stretch of dunes on the south western coasts of the Gaza Strip, is, as I said, it's a stretch of dunes. It's the least populated area in the Strip. There is no water there. There is little. There is some agriculture, but very little. There were no housing. There was no medical facilities. There was nothing that people would need in order to survive. So they expelled people into an area that had nothing and then went on bombing it whenever they wanted. So that humanitarian space was a kind of a bad euphemism for something that wasn't there. But we need to understand that the Gaza Strip is an encounter between two kinds of soil. From the west, from the sea side, there are dunes. The dunes are sand that comes actually down the Nile, all the way from the plateau, the Eritrea plateau. There is where big rocks are kind of grounded into small fragments. They are trafficked by the Nile, carried by the water, and poured millions of cubic meters a year onto the Gaza coastline. On the other side, coming from the east, from the West Bank mountain, from the Hebron mountain, is alluvial soil, is fertile soil. And roughly where Salahuddin, or the main traffic artery of the Gaza Strip, is the encounter between sand and soil. So east of the Salahuddin Road is the fertile soil of Gaza. This is where the agricultural sector is. From there, people were expelled onto the dunes, and all agriculture along the eastern part of the strip was completely destroyed, as the buffer zone, which is this complete destruction area, from the fences into the Gaza Strip, was growing and growing and growing, and destroying the agricultural areas. So people were pushed onto the sand dunes. Wadi Gaza. Why Wadi Gaza? Why were people instructed to actually be displaced south of a wadi, which is, it's not a major wadi. It's not even flowing the whole year. It's a place people know. Incidentally, it was, for many years, it was flooded with sewage and chemicals, also chemicals from Israeli. It's downstream from Israeli held area, so and was very, very polluted. So people, my friends, when they drive from Gaza to Han Yunis, remember it only as the place where you roll up the window in order to keep the smell out. Why were people expelled beyond a natural element? Nothing that is built, not beyond the street, not beyond a neighborhood, not into a named part, into a natural area, because Israel, as it came in, as the army drove in, ungrounded the entirety of the banks and of Wadi Gaza, and destroyed everything in there. It wanted to return it to its natural state. It wanted to ignore anything that was built. It wanted really to uproot Palestinians in a way that that continues the uprooting of the Nakba. And there's different types of destruction that that war can bring. If you buildings are destroyed in wars, and often you have the street network remains, and you have maybe piles of rubble on the side. And then when you reconstruct, you have the property lines that maybe were negotiated over generations between families are still there, and the land designation is still there. But the way in which Israel destroyed Gaza was very different. The bulldozers, flowed in from across the fences, stabbing the front blade a meter into the ground, driving forward, and everything on their way was ungrounded. There was nothing. It turned the strip into a kind of a moonscape, a kind of a dune area in which every road that were on their way was simply torn apart. The asphalt was torn apart. Whatever was under the road in terms of water or any other infrastructure, sewage, was bleeding onto the subsoil. It was shaving through agricultural area, cutting trees, and then, driving over them with the heavy vehicles, so that no trace remains over the surface. That's the difference between ungrounding and destruction. And also, the Gaza Strip, as you know, is a relatively flat landscape. But the architecture of genocide started to use the rubble that it was created as building material for a new type of architecture. It started creating those artificial dunes and berms, earth berms, that the tractors, the bulldozers were raising. And again, it was a rubble of destroyed buildings, very often. And it was very possible that there were people in the building, so human remains, everything that a house was, the concrete, the plaster, the plastic, everything that you have in your kitchen or in your bathroom is, broken together to produce that kind of horrific, devilish kind of mixture that was shaped by the bulldozers into dunes that were drifting wherever the military was going. And the army was piling high berms, high hills for snipers and control towers. It was raising long berms along the military roads. It's broken through the built fabric of Gaza. It was curling, creating enclosures with dunes, with these artificial dunes for its military as staging areas, as military bases. It was, we've seen images of bulldozer digging through the ground, big holes, and using that as detention facilities, putting people, usually men of military age, that were severely tortured and interrogated within them. They were using earth berms to generate pathways for people to lead them into biometric facial recognition checkpoints. So it's almost like, think about the surface of Gaza has become from solid a kind of jelly that was shaped into an artificial topography, and that was the kind of the basic architectural element of the genocide. And since Israel has broken the ceasefire early this year, it has also continuously expanded the so-called architectural elements of the genocide. So the buffer zone that until the ceasefire was about between 800 meters and 1.5 kilometers in width along the fences where everything was destroyed, that was now expanded into 3 kilometers, which is basically half of the width of the Gaza Strip, and include all the agricultural zone, all the fertile soil, was ungrounded and turned into this kind of earth berms. We've been receiving text messages and voice memos from Palestinians that we were working with that were telling us we do not even recognize, we do not even know where our land is anymore. It's completely alien to us. It looks like a desert. Where would be our meeting point where all this ended? It became a completely alien landscape. So, since it broke the ceasefire, Israel expanded the buffer zone. It has created another huge. It's now in the process of destroying and has already destroyed the majority of Rafa, of the city of Rafa, creating a 3-kilometer buffer zone along the Egypt-Palestine border in Rafa. Just like, by the way, the Egyptians have done back in the late 2010s when they have destroyed Rafah and moved Egyptian Rafah, 5 kilometers into the Sinai, and it has broken through other corridors. It is actually reshaping through destruction, and I think it's very important to understand that every act of destruction that is happening cannot be explained as the Israeli legal team has attempted in The Hague and elsewhere to say this is a response to resistance. This is a response to a preconceived plan that its aim is to render Gaza uninhabitable. There's a category in the Genocide Convention. So, Genocide Convention under what's called the special intent, the intent to destroy people in whole or in part, forbid 5 acts. And some of them are direct issues of direct violence, direct killing and maiming and wounding. And some of them are about reproduction right. But one category in the Genocide Convention is very architectural. And it forbids the inflicting on a people conditions of life calculated to bring about their destruction. So it's not about direct violence. It's not about directly shooting somebody into a hole, as happened with the medics just at the end of March. But it is about creating. It's an attack on architecture. It's an attack on the landscape. Because think about it, humans, in order to survive, we humans are like mussels without a shell. We are exposed to the element. We need so much in order to survive. And the city and architecture is what provides for us shelter. It's what provides for us the heat that we need and the facilities and the infrastructure. And all that is existing within the environment that we build, the artificial environment. The city is like the shell that the mussel without a shell assembles around itself. So if you want to kill the mussel, you break the shell, and human life would be exposed to the element and would not be able to survive. And I think that this is what the ultimate aim here in Gaza is, to create an unlivable environment. Not engage in direct killing. That is, of course, they are engaging in direct killings, but this is Israelis paying some price for that. In when it is exposed, but a kind of a slow death, a kind of a death that degrades condition of life, that slowly make the area unlivable, so that people would either die or leave, and that's the aim of the architecture of genocide.
This is it's depressing hearing this, but I mean, to some extent, it's kind of putting sense to what most of us have been seeing. And I mean, you haven't even gone into the fact that a long time ago, all the schools, or almost all the schools, were done or were rendered, not workable. Every single university has been destroyed. Loads of hospitals have been destroyed. Almost every single one has been bombed. Some have been destroyed. How are Palestinians still surviving? There's been a blockade on food now and water and everything else for almost a month. How are Palestinians still surviving in the Strip, and how much longer can they survive for, just given your understanding of the destruction that's been wrought on the place?
The truth is, I don't know. And it's incredible and it's impressive. And it's a testimony to Palestinian resilience and resourcefulness that has developed throughout all those years of settler colonial dispossession. They've learned how to survive and how to, account for each other and help in doing so. I've seen incredible things. I've seen, in Al-Mawasi, in the humanitarian zone that has no water and no food, is now entering for weeks on weeks. There's no aid allowed in. They're starving them out. People are actually digging using indigenous techniques of harvesting water from dune areas by digging shallow pans. There is a small amount of sweet water that is floating over the salty water under the dune, and people are resorting to old indigenous techniques of cultivation and harvesting that. People are sharing the little food that exists. The resilience is just extraordinary. How long they could survive, this I cannot tell. We must immediately do everything that we can at all the time, at any given opportunity, at any given platform, to call for the end of this genocidal campaign and justice for Palestinians. And justice for Palestinians is a very complex thing. It's a long-term thing that would include and must include the right of return of Palestinians to their lands. But that boot of genocidal violence must immediately stop, and Israel must be held to account for what it is doing. I mean, it seems like Israel's own survival as a state depends on the destruction of all norms and codes of international law, and you can see that is happening. So if international law that is applied to anyone in the world, to any state, need to be destroyed in order for this one settler colonial state to survive, this is what they do now. And they have support in that. They have support from European and the US. The so-called global North is completely complicit in supporting that. That France, Germany, Poland would, discard the principles of international. And I'm not even speaking about the crazies of the contemporary Trump administration or Orban in Hungary. I'm speaking about states that consider themselves as liberal democracies, but actually are genocide enabling state, including the state that hosts us both now, the United Kingdom, which is it's steeped in Palestinian blood up until its elbows.
We'll return later on in the conversation back to Gaza, the present, and just ask some questions about accountability and governance. But you mentioned while you were speaking to me earlier on about how Israel's ungrounding parts of the Gaza Strip. I understand you're writing a book called Ungrounding, which is the Architecture of Genocide, which goes back to how Israel kind of has created an ethnic cleansing sort of / genocide architecture around Gaza from 1948. Can you tell us a bit about what you're uncovering in that research and what you found with that?
October 7th has, just to say that it's, that it kind of has history, it's obvious. But every element that Palestinian fighters attacked on October 7th, the military bases, the fences, the settlements, the road junctions, have been elements that have been gradually put in place from really during the last months of the Nakba, where Israeli forces turned their attention into southern Palestine and western Palestine. All of them have history. It's almost like the slow violence of architecture and planning that was configured to put the Gaza Strip under siege erupted in that moment. And it was really interesting for me to look at the history of those elements and discover things, or maybe discover for me, because I was also referring to to great and learned a lot, particularly from the greatest chronicler of the Nakba and the advocate of the right of return, Salman Abu Sitta, whose village of origin, the village where he was born, Ma'in Abu Sitta, was really just left outside of the what became the Gaza Strip in the after the Nakba. To discover that history from the point of view of architecture. And it is interesting. It was interesting for me to go into the archive, into the architectural archive, and see that the very idea of the Gaza Strip required, in fact, two territorial zones of Israeli settler colonialism. There was always two. There was the Strip, and there was a frontier around it that now is called the envelope. Israel only came up with the term the envelope in the early 2000s, but it's a very apt term to describe the settler colonial geography that put the Strip under siege. So we tend to say, Gaza was under siege for the last two decades since Hamas took power, since 2007, etc. Israel instituted a blockade, but the Gaza Strip was under siege from the moment of its creation in the wake of the Nakba. There was never a period where people from Gaza could go and cross the border, no, it wasn't the border, but cross into the rest of Palestine, return to their land. There was never a time where water flew from the West Bank hills into the coast without interruption. There was never a time where labor and exchange of goods between Gaza and Palestine was not regulated through the settler colonial apparatus. So the Gaza Strip is an artificial zone that kind of resulted a result of the Nakba that is effectively synonymous with siege. The Gaza Strip is the Gaza siege. So what put Gaza under siege? And you see that really immediately after the first ceasefire negotiations between Israel and Egypt in the Greek island of Rhodes in the early 1949, Israel began to fortify the frontier, to outline a kind of a border of fortification around Gaza with agrarian settlements. These were a series of kibbutzim, so this is a kind of a cooperative agrarian settlements that share the means of production. Usually its members are armed and the men are trained, they're soldiers, so it's a kind of military agrarian outpost. But there was no fence around the Gaza Strip. There was a series of several dozens of kibbutzim, each one on a different road leading from what became the Gaza Strip into the rest of Palestine. That was the frontier. It was civilian settlements used as fortification. And when you look at their planning documents, you see that they were designed according to principles of defense. So I'm looking at Nirim, which was one of the settlements that was attacked on October 7, and it's built right on Abu Sitta's land, and it has the shape of a pentagon. It has the shape of a pentagon. And a pentagon, as you know, is a kind of a military it's come from a typology of military fortification, where you can cover with fire different direction. This is why the Pentagon in the US is a reference. It's actually the Department of Defense in the US is in a pentagon because that's a military shape. So one of those kibbutz on Abu Sitta's land is designed in that way. It has towers, control towers around. It has trenches around. It has two layers of fences. It has the core of the settlement is fortified buildings in the heart of it. The settlers are trained, they're armed, and between the settlements and the rest of the Gaza Strip, they have ungrounded again. So the ungrounding is the return of the Nakba. They don't only destroy remnants of Palestinian built fabric, villages, wells, cemeteries, roads, all sort of agricultural infrastructure. They don't only destroy them and leave them as rubble, they plow them. The plow that Zionists are very proud of, as you know, this is the way in which they claim to make the desert bloom or to possess land through the plow, is actually a means of erasure. When you drive a plow over a cemetery, you unground anything that is there. It's a means of erasure. And why was that erasure so total and done with plows? And that was precisely because they were worried that the Palestinians would return to their land, that they would recognize their land, that they would return, and particularly to cemeteries. People are attached to the honor of their ancestors and return to the cemeteries. At the beginning, they were returning into, to harvest the crops that they have planted. There was, they were saying, the Zionists took Palestine furnished. No, I mean, to all the crops were on the fields or in the storage house. They took it already with all the with all the agricultural produce that was produced by the land. So Palestinians were returning to, sometimes to harvest, sometimes to pick up the citrus fruits from the trees, sometimes to harvest some of the barley or wheat, which is the area around Gaza is very, very known for. So Israel has completely ungrounded that entire zone, not only destroyed, but ungrounded, so nothing would be recognizable. And of course, and this is something that Salman Abu Sitta makes a great point of, in the UN, in the first ceasefire agreement of February 49, Israel was allowed some outposts, platoon-sized military outposts along the frontier, because the UN did not have a concept of agrarian settler colonialism. And Israel, instead of putting platoons, put farmers, and the farmers actually expanded the borders of the area under their control with a plow. So ungrounding became a way of possessing that land. Only the first time that a fence was put around the Gaza Strip was after the occupation, paradoxically. And it was done in the 70s when Israeli soldiers under Ariel Sharon were raiding and destroying Palestinian refugee camps in the north of the Gaza Strip, trying to push Palestinians. There was always the same direction, trying to push Palestinians from the north to the south, from across Wadi Gaza. So the refugee camps north of Wadi Gaza, Jabalia, Al-Shati, and others, were those that suffered the most of the destruction, and Israel was pushing Palestinians at the time towards Rafa, also hoping that they would cross into Israeli-occupied Sinai, where they were trying to build them homes for the refugees. So that you can see a kind of a repetition of patterns that were established during the Nakba, the kind of the erasure, the destruction, so that nothing is recognizable, the expulsion from north to south and into Egypt, the buffer zone that was initially, on the so-called Israeli side of the Gaza Strip, initially was occupied by the farmers and then started to crawl in deeper and deeper and deeper into the Gaza Strip. The story is not beginning, definitely in October 7th, but all the elements that were of the genocide and the architecture of genocide were already put in place. Also, the settlements that were built in Gaza starting in the early 1970s, where obviously they were not just settlement points, they needed roads and infrastructure to connect them. So they became also the footprint of the architecture of current genocide. For example, one of the first settlements that was built under the encouragement of Ariel Sharon as part of means to control the Gaza Strip was the Netzarim settlement on the banks of Wadi Gaza. And it was served by a fortified militarized road called the Netzarim Corridor that was put in place in the 1970s. And when Israel rolled in November 2023, it retraced. The first thing it's done is retrace that corridor and build a military fortification where that settlement was. Not to mention destroying all the university buildings, schools, and agricultural zone and houses around that area and ungrounding them. Now Israel is building another corridor. Everybody is seeing the maps of destruction. It's called the Morag corridor in the south. The Morag corridor was serving a settlement called Morag, initially called Nahal Khan Yunis, which is the Nahal is the kind of military agrarian, is a type of military agrarian settlement. So Morag or Nahal Khan Yunis was there to separate between Khan Yunis and Rafa. It was placed very close to Salahuddin Road. All the settlements were actually controlling the road, like putting a hand on the breathing, kind of tube on the lifeline of Gaza. And now that becomes the Morag corridor, which is going to be parallel to the Netzarim corridor. And it seems to me that between the Morag corridor and the Netzarim corridor is the city of Rafa, and the entirety of it is being destroyed right now. So, and there are other infrastructure of the architecture of occupation that was in place between the 1970s and 2005, when Israel, under successful resistance by Hamas and other organizations, decided it cannot defend anymore the settlements and remove them. That, of course, Israel destroyed the settlements before because it didn't want to see Palestinians living in what's called Jewish homes, another kind of like racist conception in that. But although they were destroyed, they were kind of under the surface, and they kind of erupted. This geography of occupation that was repressed was kind of erupted to the surface. And in Israel, the relation between military and civilian agrarian infrastructure is very, very close. It's very entangled. It's difficult to set them apart sometimes. And now we're seeing military fortifications, military bases where the old settlements of that were in the Gaza Strip are. So yeah, this is a story of continuity, a story of the way in which we can learn so much by looking at space. We can learn so much by understanding the architectural logic of occupation, of ethnic cleansing, of genocide. Just looking at space allows you to tell the story in a very complete way, in a historical way.
A few questions come again to my mind as you were speaking. The first question is from 1948, just sort of what were the water sources available to people in Gaza? Especially because you mentioned that the water sources from the West Bank were kind of interfered with, that would run through Gaza. So what were the water sources? And then secondly, what's the legacy of the tunnels? There's this, the Hasbara has painted it as the tunnels have all been built by Hamas, and they're there to all the money that has been funneled into Gaza through aid. That's what they've used. What's the legacy of the tunnels? How much of it do you think, in your idea, obviously you may not have an exact idea, but how much of that has been built by Hamas, and how much has been there for other reasons? Just that's one question. And then how has Gaza, what's been the traditional water source for Gaza from 1948 until now?
Strangely, this is the same question, because many of the Palestinians that were displaced into what became the Gaza Strip were displaced in the last months of 1948 from the huge basin of Wadi Gaza. So Wadi Gaza, it's like a small stream when it gets into Gaza, but it has a huge drainage basins coming all the way from the Hebron Mountain. And all along it, there are hundreds of tributaries that kind of join into it. And along each one of those tributaries were different branches, families, clans, and tribes of Palestinian Bedouins that were were permanently living along that, and of course they were settling along the arteries and tributaries of Wadi Gaza, because that is where water is, and everybody, farmers from that part, know that the wells in the southern part of Palestine are the deepest in Palestine. Sometimes, in Ma'in Abu Sita, they had to dig a well which is close to 100 meters deep in order to extract water. In other part of Palestine, in Jalil, in the north, in the West Bank, you find water trapped in rock formation, much higher up the subsoil. So there has developed amongst the communities that were living in the northern Nakab and in this area, mainly Palestinian Bedouins, but not all. The distinction between the tribal societies and the Falahin was not always very clear. There was a lot of intermarriage and there was a kind of mixture. But they have developed an indigenous technique of deep water welling. And think about 100-meter deep well is an engineering feat that is no lesser than 100-meter tall tower. The earth is moving. There's a lot of dynamic. There's a lot of things that are unstable. You need to, and they're very, very thin and very deep water wells. A lot of those tribal societies in the Wadi Gaza area were expelled downstream from October to December 1948 into the Gaza Strip. So a lot of the people in the Gaza Strip are farmers, landless farmers. And farmers understand the relation between surface and depth. And also, a lot of the people that expelled into the Gaza Strip are traders. A lot of the people that inhabited northern Sinai and the Nakab areas, this is a very important trade route between historically, for thousands of years, between the kingdoms of the Nile and the kingdom of the Euphrates. And passing through the coastal route, that route that skirts between dunes and alluvial soil, which is now called Salahuddin Road, in the part that is within the Gaza Strip, but in the past it was the Jaffa Gaza Highway. So combine those two indigenous skills: one, navigation and trade, and the other, deep welling. Emerged out of those indigenous techniques, emerged really the most ingenious kind of architectural project of anti-colonial struggle. So initially, they were not at all meant to, they did not emerge for military purposes. They were families that were, concentrated in this concentration camp of the Gaza Strip, and there were clan members, let's say of the Tarabin, one of the biggest Bedouin Palestinian tribe, that were on the other side, on the Egyptian side of the Rafa border. So I'm talking about after 1982, as part of the Camp David Accord, Israel withdraws from Sinai, from the entirety of Sinai, April 1982, and all of a sudden, a city, Rafa, that has a side in Egypt and a side in Palestine, is a divided city, like divided Berlin, and you have relatives and clan members on both sides, and they have the memory, the agricultural memory, and the technique of digging deep wells. So the wells are going on both sides, and any to dig a tunnel, to excavate a tunnel, is when you have the well, you've done 80% of the work, because then you just need the horizontal part. You drop a tunnel, you drop a well on the Egyptian side. You keep the well, you don't go all the way to the water. You go above the water level. You drop the well on the Palestinian side, and then you need to navigate in the subsoil to find that the end of that well. And so those tunnels existed, allowed families to connect, allowed people to trade, allowed people to live. As I say, the Gaza Strip is synonymous with a siege, and tunnels are always been anti-siege instruments. In the history of siege warfare, tunnels is the way to bypass siege, is the way to supply a city under siege, is a way to arrive at the back of an army and attack it, the surrounding army from the back. So, but the tunnel that crosses a border is only the bypass. It's only the short material bypass of a long trade route that extends all the way to warehousing in El Arish, or port in Port Said, or indeed to Alexandria, or to other parts, to trade routes that are continuous all the way to the Libyan coast at some point. So you have very long trade routes that just need a physical bypass, and the agricultural knowledge, the indigenous knowledge, was there to do that. And indeed, at the periods where Gaza, with the siege, tightened into the blockade, let's say in the past 2 decades, where Israel put this crazily violent, humiliating blockade where every calorie was counted, with products were allowed or disallowed by Israel. That was the way for Palestinians to survive, and it's a testimony for the for the indigenous knowledge that has remained, for the way of systematizing it, bringing it up to the present time, to a present era, connecting it with trade routes, collaborating, daring, risk-taking, all those things that make Palestinians so resilient in this part went into the tunnel project. And Rafa, during the times of in the 20 teens, became all of a sudden from a backwater, from the poorest city in the Gaza Strip, became a place that was just like a market city. I mean, there was everything you could buy there. You could see even animals to the Gaza Zoo were actually smuggled from under the tunnels, cars, products, etc. And that allowed Gaza to withstand the degradation of conditions of life. We were speaking before about conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of a people. A siege is the calculation, is the weaponization of conditions of life, and tunnels were a way to survive and avoid it. And of course, during the time of the Second Intifada, Palestinian armed groups understood the tactical advantage of the tunnels, and from trade routes they have become means to attack the occupation forces bases. So people were boring under bases and putting bombs underneath them, just like in a First World War, in a trench warfare. That was the British miners that were putting explosive under German lines. It was something like that. And then when Hamas took over the Gaza Strip, of course, it has understood it as the potential of tunnels as a military strategy, and has constructed a very extensive network under Gaza. Is, by the way, very effective as means of resistance. It seems, I've just read now that the Israeli army, now as in today, the Israeli army is saying today that it thinks it has destroyed 20% of the tunnel networks. Firstly, we need to take everything they say with extremely skeptically. But why would they say that they only manage, after a year and a half of genocide, when they are there, when they've done all that thing, that's, they haven't even been able to do that. And I think to a great extent, the ability of Palestinian resistance to withstand and to survive intact, not fully intact, of course, but to still be a military challenge to Israeli occupation forces is to do with the network of the tunnel. It's an incredible architectural project that is, as I say, its origins are with local knowledge, farmers' knowledge, and emerged into something that is much more like a network or like a social network that connects surface and depth with millions of, not million, with hundreds of different knots.
You wrote Hollow Land. I think it was back in 2008, right? And that was really your first attempt to take all of your knowledge as an architect, as an architect, and sort of map out how Israel has controlled the West Bank for decades. Can you just walk us through sort of what were the origins of that book? Like what sort of observations did you get before that to sort of realize that there's a project here, and that you should do that? And also, just what was the journey before that? So, what I mean, just give us a sense of where the origins of you as a person and the idea for that book sort of emerged, and what's in the book.
So you hear my name and my accent, and I think the listeners should know that I was I'm Israeli born. I was born in Haifa. Haifa is a city, the kind of the hills, where there has remained a Palestinian community that survived the Nakba. It was always contained architecturally in the valley. It was, where I was born and where kind of like the Israeli middle class lives is up on a hill, and where the Palestinians were living was on the valley. And several things I started to kind of understand the architectural and topographical nature of settler colonialism, and then started recognizing it also in the West Bank. When I was an architectural student, I volunteered at the Palestinian Ministry of Planning. It was in the 90s, maybe a naive act, but I've learned also that they didn't have maps. They were not given the maps. They were given a kind of a territorial puzzle of like 200 isolated enclaves, so-called Area A's and B's in the West Bank, but they did not receive the maps, no aerial images. It was a time before satellite images, and I was going and photographing maps from Israeli archives and university libraries and bringing it there, and understood the political nature and the political power of cartography. And then I thought that, I studied architecture, and, it's not, I didn't study it for nothing. I studied it because, I'm interested in space. I'm interested in architecture as a way of organizing society. I went to study architecture as an idealist, as almost utopianist. I wanted to do that in order to create, a just society, etc. But I started to understand that if you put architecture as a lens, as an optical device and you start looking at the world through architecture, you start seeing things that you cannot see by other frameworks of journalism or economy or historians or political scientists. You see things differently, and that has been my life project since. To use architecture as a field of knowledge, to use architecture to analyze and to investigate. But the initial move that from which HoloLand emerged is that I said, if architecture is political and if architecture is a form of warfare in the settler colonial context, we cannot disregard architects when we call for accountability. So usually, human rights and international law regard the soldiers, police officers, politicians as the perpetrators, and I thought architects were perpetrators, and I wanted to write a report, and I did write a human rights report that would incriminate architects for work they do on the drawing board, for the way they draw a particular shape, a settlement, a road, a neighborhood, as a means of generating damage, as a means of control, as a means of occupation, as a means of ethnic cleansing. Because, if you build around a neighborhood in Jerusalem two Jewish settlements like that, and you bisect it with roads, your aim is to make the people surrounded leave. And so architecture was a tool of ethnic cleansing and colonization. So I have looked and analyzed enormous amount of maps I collected in Israeli planning archives, and looked at the way that they were organizing space, and realized that many of the architects were also military officers, and they had military kind of understanding in the way that they were laying out buildings. And out of that emerged also the practice of forensic architecture, which uses architecture to produce evidence for war crimes, state violence. All over the world, we have now forensic architecture is at the center of a community of practice that extend over. We have offices, affiliated offices in Bogota and in Mexico and in Brazil and in Istanbul and in Athens. And of course, the first one off-site forensic architecture place was in Al-Haq, the first and biggest, I think, human rights organization in the Arab-speaking world. And an organization was declared by Israel without any evidence and without any logic as a terrorist group, simply because they feel that when you're the perpetrator, producing the truth is what terrorizes the state. And we have established, together with great Palestinian architects that are running it, particularly Ashraf, who's running that center under the guidance of Shawan Jabarin, a forensic architectural hack unit who's doing really important work and using techniques that we've developed and experimented with to confront settler colonialism on the ground. And this is not work that is remote. It is not work that is based only on satellite images, etc., but on familiarity with the terrain, on witness testimonies, on being there on the ground with the people that are confronting and at the forefront of struggle.
I wanna ask you, just based on what you said, just how forensic architecture goes about putting a report, and I will ask you that. But before we get there, just before you even sort of wrote the book and started seeing and noticing the patterns, what was your first sort of realization of the extent of the occupation and the unjustness of it, especially as an Israeli born in Haifa, and I'm assuming brought up as an Israeli would be?
Yeah, so you need to tear layers and layers and filters, because the education system teaches you not to see but to unsee. To unsee what you see, meaning you're looking and you see a building that remains surrounded by cactus, prickly pear trees as you drive from Haifa to Tel Aviv, and people are telling you, "Oh, that's ancient ruin, maybe Byzantine," whereas that is maybe the mosque or the Han in a Palestinian village that was brutally depopulated. You need to learn to see, to trust your eyes, that actually what you see is what you see. And then when you start peeling those filters, those ideological educational filters, you're able to see Zionism for what it is. And I think that space and architecture are central. Settler colonialism is about space, it's about land. And to obtain land, you have different strategies and different tactics and means of destruction and construction. And it's all about transformation of a landscape from the indigenous landscape into a settler colonial one, using, architectural techniques. So it's a slow process, but it's about learning to see, I would say.
And when about more or less in your life was it that you were able to see Zionism for what it is?
As I said, growing up in Haifa was one of the greatest kind of gifts that I had in order to understand the topographical and architectural logic. But it was really during my architectural education that I was able to name, to understand, to map, and draw the realities of the occupation, and then working for the Ministry of Planning, and then producing this report on the complicity of architects.
Okay, so coming back to tell us more about Al-Haq and just where it's situated. Also tell us about the broader work that forensic architecture does. And I understand that you're basically a research department at a university in London, Goldsmiths University, and just what goes into obviously it's different depending on the report, case by case, but what sort of what's needed in terms of your team. You need investigative journalists, you need architects, you need visual sort of people who can visualize things. Just what goes into producing a forensic architecture report?
That's a great question. Yeah, forensic architecture is a multidisciplinary team. We're based at Goldsmiths, but we have also, as I said, affiliated offices all over the world that are doing the work on the ground and with the communities together. Forensic architecture is seeing space and politics and warfare through architectural lenses. So we are able to build architectural models and maps and all these kind of studies. But I guess that we founded forensic architecture back in 2010 at at a kind of technological transition period. So there was the moment where what is called the open source revolution has begun. People started having smartphones. The smartphones had cameras, and there were social media websites in which all of a sudden you did not need to send experts or photojournalists or people into a war zone, but you can actually start receiving testimonies and even a video filmed by a Palestinian or by Mexican of an atrocity performed by the army or the police is a form of testimony, is a technological testimony. And very often those videos have their speech. They also narrate what is going on while they are filming. And sometimes what we use to see is, you got a good video that captures, or horrific video, but useful video that captures both perpetrator and victim in the same frame, and that can go viral. But for anyone like that, you have hundreds, if not thousands, of videos that just show part of an incident. They show what happened before. They show an army coming, and then another one shows a drone in the sky, and then another one shows a few kids running through an alleyway, and then the other one would show an ambulance, and another one would show a soldier shooting from one direction, and you need to build all those fragments into a story. And we realized that architectural models is the best archive and the best medium to put in relation to each other those different bits of evidence. So you build an architectural model, you locate dozens and dozens of videos within it, and then you can navigate from one to the other and build. There's another architectural metaphor in the way that we build evidence by weaving together the different source material into a single case. And also you would know that our memory as humans is very architectural. Sometimes you would go into a place where something has happened and you would recall something that maybe you've forgotten. We all know memory palaces as means of remembering complex sequence of things or stories by locating memories in different rooms and then moving through the space. And we understand that witnesses to extreme violence are very often traumatized. And very often trauma affects the capacity of narrating and the capacity of remembering and recalling what has taken place. So very often we sit together with witnesses and build together the site where things happen. So, we had a huge project with Grenfell survivors where we were sitting with those survivors that wanted to undertake that process and build together in 3D environment, like architects do, their flats in the tower, flat by flat and object by object. And that brought back recollection, but they had also a model of a space that was lost. And then in an immersive eye level perspective, almost like I know this, it sounds bizarre or flippant, but almost like in a computer game, but in a much more serious way, you can walk through that space that you've built, and walking through that space again allow you to describe and recall things that might have been otherwise forgotten, or you can describe them in a better way. And that allowed us in a Grenfell tower fire, that tower in London, this housing a tower in London that was burned in 2017 because of the very, very near your offices, by the way, where the council has put flammable cladding on and led to the killing of 72 people in it. We've done that in many other places. So architecture as a means of knowing, as a means of research, of many manifestations. And this is why you need also a multidisciplinary team. So a lot of our members are architects because they know how to build 3D environments and analyze maps and cities and buildings for what has happened to them. But we are working with legal professionals, and we're working with filmmakers, and we're working with scientists, and we're working with lawyers, etc. So at the end, it's a very multidisciplinary team because the problem requires all those skills coming together.
I know you need to run in a short while, so I'm going to start bringing this to an end. If there's one sort of thing that you'd want viewers who are seeing this or listeners to sort of just understand through the research you and your team have put through in the last 18 months through Gaza's genocide, what's that one thing?
Yeah, I would like people to understand the long history of that genocide. I would like people to understand that violence, when you enter something as an architect, you look at violence at different speeds. There is the slow violence of building of the colonies and building of roads, and the slow sucking of life out of villages or towns, as we see in the occupied West Bank, as we see in the Jalil, in the Nakab, in many parts of Palestine, as we have seen in the slow degradation of Gaza through the envelope and the communities that are built along it. But violence of architecture can move from slow to fast. It can accelerate, it can erupt. And then it erupts into a genocide that has its own architectural logic, where, as you said very well, all schools, all hospitals, all public facilities, the majority of homes in Gaza have been completely destroyed. But understanding also that destruction has its own architectural logic. That destruction is always a form of construction of something else. And what has been constructed is the tightening of the Gaza Strip concentration area, creating an environment where life is not possible, using architectural means to displace and destroy. And I would like people leaving this podcast or video knowing that architecture is not innocent, that architecture is really the means of perpetrating genocide here in this context.
We were speaking earlier on about accountability, and that no one really knows how much longer people in Gaza can sort of survive, can live, how they'll even be able to rebuild if there's ever an opportunity to rebuild. It's a difficult question. It's very philosophical because unfortunately can't be practical because of the way the world has been architectured. But what does accountability, you think, eventually look like? Or is accountability going to sort of come back in some other way through karma, or maybe Israeli society will change? What do you think the future of this is regarding accountability and Israel and Gaza and Palestine?
I don't see, um, the reconstruction of Gaza by any means. We've also seen the Egyptian master plan, which is purportedly put as an alternative to Trump's kind of expulsion, Trump and Israel expansion plan. But the Egyptian master plan is horrible. It is actually taking the Israeli footprint of destruction and constructing by accepting the realities imposed by Israel. It is, and likewise, any form of reconstruction to come from the outside that would not have Palestinian society and architects leading it and building in a way that they see fit is going to be another means of control. It's going to be the continuation of the genocide by other means. Now, also, the thinking about reconstruction within the framework of the Gaza Strip is accepting the Gaza Strip as a reality. And I think we should not accept it. I think it's an anomaly. We should always claim that it's an anomaly. The majority of people there are refugees and they need to have access to their own lands and return to them and receive their property back. And so it's very difficult to think about reconstruction within the framework of the Gaza Strip. So, like some others, I am of the opinion that only a single democratic state in the areas between the river and the sea, the freedom, what it means, freedom between the river and the sea, is a total democracy for all within that area. As I've been born through a settler colonial society in a place, but that's the place I was born, and I would want to be committed to justice and equality there. Until that time, I would use my privilege in order to annul my privileges. I don't think I deserve any privileges in that part. So, a single democratic state, the return of Palestinian refugees, the redistribution of resources there, and a democracy in that place is something that is so obvious, so simple, and right now so hard to imagine if you're looking through the barrel of a gun.
Eyal Weizman, thank you very much for your time, and it was really good speaking to you. I'd like to speak to you again sometime in the future because there's a lot to obviously unpack.
It will be a pleasure to speak to you again. Thank you very much, and great to be back on the program.
Excellent. Thank you so much.